the corner of my ticket still bent in my daughter-in-law's fist as she snapped, "You're not coming." Still, I stood there. Her mother-in-law, not her servant, watching her turn away like I didn't matter. As the overhead speaker called our flight, the scent of jet fuel sharpened the insult in the air. While my son stayed silent, glued to his phone, I realized I'd raised a passenger, not a partner. The same ticket she tried to steal became my quiet declaration. That's when I booked first class, solo, silent, and one row above their entitlement. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Maggie stood by the gate, the quiet hum of the airport a familiar companion. She had arrived early, just as she always did, with her bags packed neatly and her itinerary printed in crisp, perfect text. A lifetime of coordinating travel had taught her to prepare for the smallest of details. The boarding pass, tucked in her bag, was like a promise. Everything was in order, and she was ready. She checked the time again. It was still 8:30 a.m., a full half hour before her son, Ryan, and his family were due to arrive. There was no rush. Not for her. She leaned back against the cool wall, taking a moment to enjoy the small sense of peace before the chaos began. When they finally appeared, they were anything but calm. Ryan, the eternal creature of habit, was the first to arrive, his face drawn with the familiar tension that accompanied every trip. Allison followed, her eyes narrowed, scanning the airport as though it were an inconvenient inconvenience. Sienna trailed behind them, her eyes wide, holding onto Ryan's hand with an almost desperate grip. Allison's gaze landed on Maggie instantly, and the moment her mother-in-law's eyes met hers, something dark flickered across her face. "You weren't supposed to check in yet," Allison snapped, her voice carrying an edge that cut through the bustling sounds around them. Maggie didn't flinch, she simply smiled, a quiet, controlled curve of her lips. "You told me 9:06 sharp," she said, her tone even. No accusation, no bite, just the simple truth. But Allison was already reaching for the boarding pass, her fingers trembling with a certain sharpness. Without another word, she snatched it from Maggie's hands and waved it in the air. "Stay home, Maggie. We don't have room." The words hit Maggie with the force of an unexpected gust of wind, but there was no storm behind them, just cold, calculated dismissal. Ryan's mouth opened, but the words he might have spoken caught in his throat. He glanced nervously at the gate agent, Deshawn, who was watching the exchange with wide eyes. He cleared his throat, shifting on his feet. I didn't know you," Ryan began, but Maggie held up a hand, silencing him. There was no need for him to apologize. No need to placate Allison's cold glare. Deshawn, who had worked the gates for years and seen his fair share of family dramas, stood stock still, his professional mask perfectly intact. But his eyes flicked between Maggie and the boarding pass in Allison's hand, the weight of the situation not lost on him. Maggie's voice was soft, but unwavering as she spoke. "I'll stay home when you've given me a reason to." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Allison's eyes widened for a split second, disbelief flashing across her face before she quickly masked it with a look of feigned indifference. She didn't respond, only turned to face the gate agent, the thin smile on her lips more a show of power than politeness. But Maggie wasn't looking at Allison anymore. Her attention shifted to Deshawn, who stood behind the desk, his fingers drumming nervously on the counter. She could see the hesitation in his eyes, the silent plea for this to be over, but Maggie didn't rush him. She could feel him weighing his options, his professional duty battling against the unspoken understanding they shared, that sometimes dignity had a price. Deshawn gave a subtle nod. He wasn't sure what Maggie was planning, but he had the feeling she was going to take care of it herself. "Ma'am," he finally spoke, his voice just above a whisper. Maggie's lips curled in a quiet smile and she pulled out her Amex without a second thought. "I'll take the first-class seat, What's the availability? Deshawn glanced down at the screen, typing quickly. 1 seat. The price flashed on the monitor. $947, immediate boarding. Perfect. She slid the card across the counter without a flicker of hesitation. He looked up at her with something close to admiration, and, with a discreet nod, he processed the transaction. I won't mention you to them, he promised, knowing all too well that the last thing Maggie wanted was to give Allison any further ammunition. Good, Maggie said, her smile never wavering. I'm flying solo. Allison was still distracted, pulling Ryan into an increasingly tense conversation, and Maggie seized the moment. She moved to the side of the counter, silently handing Deshawn her boarding pass as she made her way through the gate without another word. As she walked past, she could hear Allison's voice rise slightly in frustration. Maggie allowed herself the smallest of smiles before she disappeared into the jetway, the door closing behind her with the finality of a decision already made. The first-class cabin would be hers, and this flight would be hers alone. The hum of the engines grew louder, and for the first time in a long while, Maggie felt the thrill of flying free, unburdened, uninvited, but no less deserving. The gate area buzzed with the low, constant murmur of travelers, the sound of rolling luggage, and distant announcements over the intercom. Maggie moved through the crowd with quiet purpose, her heels clicking steadily against the floor. She was no longer a part of the hectic scene around her. Not really. Not anymore. Not after what Allison had just said. Her mind was already 2 steps ahead, plotting a new course, one where she wasn't tethered to the expectations of a family who saw her as little more than a burden. She walked with a steady confidence, the kind that only comes from making a decision so final that nothing could pull her from it. Deshawn, standing behind the counter, caught her approach from the corner of his eye. His gaze flicked to the side, where Allison's voice had already started to rise in agitation. Ryan looked overwhelmed, as usual, but there was a tightness around his eyes. He never liked confrontations, especially not between his wife and his mother. Maggie could feel his silent panic, but she wasn't there for him. Not today. Maggie. Deshawn greeted her softly, his voice low enough to avoid the other passengers' attention. Deshawn. Maggie's voice was quiet, but firm. How's first class looking? She didn't need to look at the monitor. She had already made up her mind. But there was a part of her that enjoyed watching Deshawn's fingers dance across the keyboard as he quickly checked availability. 1 seat left, he said, his voice just above a whisper. $947, immediate boarding. Maggie nodded, the decision already set in her chest. No hesitation, no regret. She reached into her purse, pulling out her American Express card with the same precision that she'd used to book every flight in her life. Her fingers gripped the card for just a moment, feeling its cool smoothness between her fingertips, the weight of it almost like a promise. With a simple motion, she slid it across the counter. Book it, she said softly, the words precise and clear. She leaned in a little closer, lowering her voice even further. But don't mention me to them. Deshawn's eyes flickered, and for a second there was a brief moment of understanding. He was good at this, reading between the lines, sensing when someone didn't want to make a scene. His nod was almost imperceptible, but it was there. Yes, ma'am, he replied, and Maggie didn't need anything more than that. She could hear Allison talking in the background now, her voice carrying over to where Maggie stood. The words were sharp, the tone unmistakable. Allison had already moved on to something else. Maggie didn't care. It didn't matter what she was saying. This moment was hers. As Deshawn processed the transaction, Maggie allowed herself a small, almost imperceptible smile. She'd already won. Not in the way people usually thought of revenge, but in the only way that truly mattered. She was reclaiming her own space. Once the transaction was complete, Deshawn handed her the boarding pass, which she accepted with a quiet nod. She didn't waste a second more. Turning her back to the gate area, Maggie began to walk toward a different lane, the one reserved for first-class passengers. As she moved past the line of people waiting to board, she felt the faintest pull of a gaze, a weight of eyes on her back. She didn't turn around, didn't give them the satisfaction. She wasn't interested in the drama they'd surely stir up once they realized what she had done. Behind her, Allison's voice reached a new pitch, higher, more frantic. But Maggie didn't need to hear the details. She had learned long ago that most people were far more interested in being heard than in actually listening. And as Maggie passed through the first-class lane, the attendant's polite smile welcoming her, she felt a wave of something she hadn't expected. It wasn't relief. It was satisfaction. Her seat was waiting for her. A comfortable space where she didn't have to explain herself to anyone. The soft leather of the chair, the luxury she had long since earned, felt like an old friend. She sank into it, the familiar hum of the plane starting to vibrate through the floor. "Excuse me, ma'am," the flight attendant said, arriving at her side with a tray of drinks. "Champagne," Maggie replied, her voice as cool as the glass that would soon be in her hand. She settled back into her seat, her eyes resting for just a moment on the window as the plane began to taxi. The airport, her son, her daughter-in-law. It all started to feel distant, blurry. The world outside the window seemed far more inviting than anything left behind. A quiet, satisfied smile tugged at her lips as she looked down at her phone. Lucille's name flashed across the screen, and Maggie answered without hesitation. "I trust you've ordered champagne?" Lucille's voice rang in her ear, light and teasing. "Of course." Maggie paused, glancing at the glass now set before her. "Just as you said." Lucille laughed softly. "Well, I'd expect nothing less." As the plane began to rise, Maggie stared ahead, her mind already moving to the next step. She had taken control of this moment, and now it was time to enjoy it. In the distance, below her, the ground seemed smaller, like all the small frustrations and indignities of the past few days were slipping away, just as the earth receded beneath her. And as the plane ascended into the sky, Maggie finally allowed herself to exhale. It wasn't just the altitude, it was the freedom. The battle had begun, and this was just the first victory. The moment Maggie stepped into the first-class cabin, she felt the subtle shift in the air. It was as if the world had paused for just a second, acknowledging her quiet defiance. Her seat was ready, awaiting her. Like a private oasis in the midst of chaos. She sank into it with a slow, deliberate motion, as though she had done this 1,000 times. And in a way, she had. The flight attendant, a young woman with warm, practiced eyes, greeted her immediately with a polite smile. "Ma'am, may I take your coat?" she asked. Maggie didn't hesitate. She slipped out of her light cardigan, draping it over the attendant's arm. "Thank you." She settled back into the plush leather chair, the soft hum of the aircraft enveloping her like a blanket. Outside the window, the last remnants of the airport blurred into the distance, and the plane's engines began to purr with anticipation. She was airborne, free. But she was also still keenly aware of the scene unfolding behind her. She could hear the faint rustle of footsteps in the aisle, the shuffle of bags, and then the sharp, incredulous whisper of Allison's voice. What is she doing here?" Maggie didn't turn around, but she could hear the way Allison's tone cracked. That was enough to confirm it. The shock, the disbelief, the sudden need to assert control in a place where Allison no longer had the power. Ryan's voice followed, hushed and confused. "What do you mean?" "I thought we—" Maggie could picture the moment perfectly. Ryan's brow furrowed, his hand outstretched as if to reach her, to pull her back into the drama that he so clearly hated. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had already made her decision, and she wasn't about to explain herself to him. Instead, Maggie kept her eyes straight ahead, feeling the small thrill of keeping the upper hand. This was her moment. Not Allison's, not Ryan's. Just hers. Allison's steps slowed as she reached the aisle near Maggie's seat. Maggie could feel the heat of her gaze like a weight pressing against her back. She didn't turn, didn't even flinch. "Maggie," Allison finally said, her voice strained, more brittle than Maggie had ever heard it. "This was supposed to be our trip. We made plans." "Oh, I came anyway." Maggie's voice was as calm as a lake on a summer morning, her words carefully chosen. "Didn't want to waste the trip." Allison's breath hitched. For a moment Maggie wondered if she might say something. Demand that she leave, or at least explain herself. But there was only silence, just a pulse of frustration in the air, thick and unspoken. And then, just as Allison's grip on the situation seemed to slip further, a small, familiar voice broke through the tension. "Nana!" Sienna's voice was full of delight, a high-pitched squeal that cut through the heavy atmosphere of the cabin. Maggie turned just in time to see Sienna's face light up like the sun breaking through clouds. The little girl's arms shot out, ready for the hug she'd clearly been waiting for. Maggie smiled, her heart swelling just slightly at the sight of her granddaughter. She patted the seat next to her. "Come here, sweetheart," she said, her voice warm, inviting. Sienna rushed forward, slipping into the seat beside Maggie with a brightness that felt like a tiny rebellion against the tension around them. Allison and Ryan exchanged a look. It was a quick, silent conversation, but Maggie could feel the shift. The discomfort was palpable, their irritation beginning to coalesce. They hadn't planned for this, for Maggie's quiet defiance. She had turned the tables, and now they were left to pick up the pieces. Just as Sienna settled in, the flight attendant approached with the soft, professional smile that seemed permanently fixed in place. She bent down slightly to address Allison and Ryan, her voice gently authoritative. "We need to keep first class undisturbed, ma'am," she said, her eyes flicking to the aisle where a few curious eyes had begun to peek from Coach. "You'll need to move to your seats in the back." Allison's face turned a shade darker, her cheeks flushed with something between anger and embarrassment. Ryan, predictably, opened his mouth as though he might argue, but the flight attendant was already moving smoothly away, guiding them down the aisle. Maggie, for her part, didn't watch. She had no need to. She'd already won. She turned her attention back to Sienna, who was nestled next to her, eyes wide with excitement. "Do you want some orange juice, honey?" Maggie asked, her voice soft and full of warmth. "Yes, please," Sienna answered, her hands clasped together in a gesture of anticipation. Maggie leaned back in her chair, her fingers lightly tapping the armrest. The noise of the cabin swirled around her. The laughter, the chatter, the clink of glasses, the sound of engines beginning to roar louder with every passing second. But Maggie was, for once, in control of it all. The chaos, the tension, the drama, it all felt miles away. Her gaze flickered briefly to the back of the plane, where Allison and Ryan were settling into their coach seats, the small crackle of unease still hanging in the air between them. She could feel the weight of their frustration even from here, but Maggie wasn't bothered. Not anymore. The plane began to climb into the sky, and Maggie finally allowed herself a deep breath, her chest expanding with the air that surrounded her. She was free, unburdened, and this was her flight. As the plane leveled out, she pulled out her phone, scrolling through messages until Lucille's name flashed across the screen again. "Well, Lucille," Maggie murmured softly to herself, smiling as she tapped the screen to answer. "I think we've started something." The plane touched down in Savannah with the grace of an old friend returning home. The engines slowed, and Maggie felt the familiar thrill of arrival. She looked out the window, watching as the lush green fields of Georgia began to unfurl beneath them, the slow, steady pulse of the aircraft matching the beating of her own heart. A quiet triumph filled her chest, but she remained composed, calm on the surface, like the smooth waters of a lake after the storm. As the seatbelt sign blinked off, Maggie slowly unbuckled, her movements deliberate. There was no rush now. She was no longer bound by anyone's schedule but her own. She glanced at Sienna, still beside her, eyes bright with excitement. "Ready, sweetheart?" Maggie asked with a gentle smile, reaching over to squeeze her granddaughter's hand. Sienna nodded enthusiastically. "Are we going to the beach first, Nana?" "We'll see what happens, darling, but I think there's something special waiting for us." As Maggie stood and gathered her things, she heard a voice from the front of the cabin, low but carrying the weight of authority. "Ma'am, if you'll follow me." Maggie nodded and rose, following the flight attendant down the aisle, the subtle nod she'd given Deshawn before departure now coming to fruition. Deshawn had made the necessary calls, and now a private terminal transfer was arranged. A smooth, efficient exit from the plane that left her feeling more powerful than she had in days. She was escorted through a separate gate, away from the rest of the passengers, and out into the warm, Georgia air. A sleek black car was waiting for her, a sharp contrast to the usual chaos of airport shuttles and crowded taxi lines. She slipped inside, the leather seats cool against her skin, the engine humming to life as the driver silently pulled away from the terminal. Maggie allowed herself a deep breath, the kind that only comes with absolute certainty. She'd done what she needed to do. The next part of the journey, the one where she walked on her own terms, was already unfolding. The boutique inn where she was staying was just as charming as she had hoped. She had called ahead before even boarding the plane, changing her reservation the moment she'd secured her first-class seat. She had no interest in sharing a room with anyone, certainly not Allison, certainly not them. The inn, tucked away in a quiet corner of Savannah, was everything Maggie had imagined. A blend of southern charm and understated elegance, its aged wooden beams and artfully arranged antiques created an atmosphere of calm, and she could feel the tension of the airport already beginning to loosen from her shoulders. When she checked in, the receptionist greeted her with a practiced smile. And Maggie handed over her confirmation without hesitation. "I've rebooked the suite," she said, voice soft but firm. The young woman behind the counter nodded, acknowledging the change without question. Maggie hadn't expected any resistance. She had paid for this weekend, paid for her own solitude, and now it was hers to enjoy. She walked to the suite alone, her heels clicking softly on the old hardwood floors, the soft scent of fresh flowers in the air. The room was everything she'd hoped for. A blend of history and luxury, with a large bay window that looked out over the quiet streets. A deep, tufted armchair sat near the window, and Maggie immediately sank into it, feeling the weight of the day lift off her. She took out her phone and texted Lucille, as she often did when something momentous happened. "Arrived. The room is mine. All of it." Lucille's reply came almost instantly. "You know I'm living vicariously through you, right? Enjoy." Maggie smiled, the warmth of Lucille's words a balm for the part of her that still needed validation. She was entitled to this peace. She had earned it. It wasn't long before the door to her suite creaked open, and Maggie heard the soft shuffle of footsteps in the hallway. She already knew who it was before they knocked. Ryan's voice came first, soft but insistent. "Mom, can we talk?" Maggie didn't move. She simply sat in the chair, her back straight, her gaze steady. She knew this conversation was coming. It had to. There was no way Ryan would just let it go. When she finally opened the door, Ryan stood there, looking slightly out of breath. His eyes scanned the room, her room, taking in the calm, the peace. Then, just like she had expected, his gaze landed on the bed, where Allison's bags would have been if things had gone according to their plan. "Mom, look. I know this is uncomfortable for everyone, Ryan started, his voice strained. But Allison was really counting on this trip. Maggie held up a hand, cutting him off. No, Ryan. You forfeited your say when you allowed her to treat me like an inconvenience at the gate. I'm here because I earned it. This weekend is mine. Ryan blinked, his face faltering. You're not being reasonable. It was just a misunderstanding. A misunderstanding? Maggie's voice was steady, unwavering. No, Ryan. She disrespected me, and now she can find another place to stay. I booked solo. I paid solo. Behind him, she could almost feel the tension radiating from Allison, even though she hadn't yet made her entrance. Maggie didn't need to hear the words. She could already feel them in the air. The mixture of frustration, anger, and disbelief. Mom, you can't just... Ryan started again, but Maggie stepped forward, her voice cutting through his protest. You forfeited your say at the gate, Ryan. She repeated, quieter now, but no less firm. This is my trip. You can either respect that or leave. Ryan stood frozen for a moment, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of his role in this whole ordeal had finally settled onto him. Without another word, he turned, stepping back into the hall where Allison was waiting. Maggie leaned against the doorframe, listening as they retreated. She could hear Allison's muttered voice, and though Maggie couldn't make out the words, she didn't need to. The game had changed. And this time, Maggie was the one holding all the cards. The evening settled over Savannah like a velvet curtain, the humid air thick with the scent of salt water and the promise of heat in the days to come. Maggie stepped out onto the cobblestone streets, the soft click of her heels echoing in the quiet, the golden light of the setting sun reflecting off the old buildings around her. She was alone, and it felt right. The world, for just a moment, belonged to her. The waterfront restaurant she had chosen was quaint, with weathered wooden floors and low-hanging chandeliers that cast soft, warm shadows across the room. There was a certain charm about it, the kind of place that didn't need to shout its quality. Maggie settled at a corner table by the window, the view stretching out over the river, where the last rays of daylight danced on the water's surface. She ordered a glass of wine before the menu had even been set down, her fingers tapping gently on the table as she looked out at the boats bobbing gently in the harbor. The hum of conversation around her felt distant, like it belonged to someone else's life. She had earned this peace, this solitary luxury. This night was hers to savor. A moment later, the waiter arrived with her drink, and Maggie raised the glass in a quiet salute to herself. She took a sip, savoring the crisp, cool taste, letting it settle on her tongue. It was the first time in a long while that she felt truly untethered, not just from the events of the day, but from all the expectations that had been placed on her for years. The photo she posted on social media was almost automatic. The wine glass, the view, the words came to her in a rush. Travel well, especially alone. She paused just long enough to add a hashtag, "Ours living on my terms." A small victory, but it felt monumental. She watched as the likes began to trickle in, the notifications a soft reminder that there was more to her than the small corner of her family's world where she had been stifled for so long. Back at the motel across town, the mood was far less serene. Allison sat on the edge of the bed, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Ryan paced near the window, his face pinched, the weight of Maggie's defiance hanging heavy in the air between them. The room was bare, sparsely furnished with cheap wooden furniture and faded floral curtains that barely blocked out the harsh lights of the parking lot. The television flickered on with the sound of static. But neither of them were paying attention. "I can't believe she's doing this," Allison muttered, her voice low but brimming with frustration. "This was supposed to be our weekend. She's completely ruined it." Ryan didn't respond right away. Instead, he dragged a hand through his hair, staring at the floor. He felt torn, caught between his wife and his mother in a way he wasn't sure how to resolve. He wanted to appease them both, but there was no middle ground here. He had already chosen sides, and now he had to live with the consequences. Allison shot him a look, but it was one of accusation, not curiosity. "Are you going to just sit there?" she asked, her voice clipped. "This isn't normal. She's behaving like a child, throwing a tantrum." Ryan didn't want to argue anymore. He knew Allison was angry. He was angry, too. But it wasn't enough to make him forget the way his mother had stood up for herself at the airport. Maggie had done what no one else ever had. She had walked away, unbothered by the consequences, and there was something about it that had stayed with him. Maybe it was the power in her silence, in the way she had commanded the situation. "I'm going to check on Sienna," Ryan muttered, his voice distant. Maggie had already finished her dinner by the time Sienna's message came through. She had just finished a quiet dessert, chocolate mousse, rich and decadent, when her phone buzzed with the familiar sound of a text notification. "Sienna, wish I was with you." Maggie's heart softened at the words, her thumb gently swiping the screen to reply. "You're with me in spirit, sweetheart. We'll have more adventures soon. Promise." She sent the message, then placed the phone back on the table. The faint pulse of a new notification still lighting up the screen. It wasn't her, though. It was Allison. The message was short and to the point. "You can't cancel the ghost tour. I've already booked it for us." Maggie smiled to herself, amused by the futile attempt to reassert control. Allison was already trying to manage her plans that had, in Maggie's mind, been taken from her the moment Allison had snatched her boarding pass. Maggie didn't waste time. She opened the app for the ghost tour, the one she'd booked earlier in the day, and smiled again when she saw that the cancellation button was lit up in front of her. With a few taps, she denied the request. Her reservation was safe, and there was nothing Allison could do about it. The sense of calm returned, settling back into her chest. Allison's attempts to control her were like ripples on a still pond, small, insignificant. Maggie was already far beyond them. The tour would be for her and Sienna, a quiet adventure, just the two of them, experiencing Savannah on their own terms. She leaned back in her chair, gazing out over the river, feeling the world slipping further away. It didn't matter what Allison did, or where Ryan chose to stand. Maggie had already claimed her piece of it, and for the first time in a long while, it was enough. As the night deepened, Maggie set her phone down with a sense of finality, a soft smile tugging at her lips. The game had only just begun, and the rules had already shifted in her favor. Maggie's fingers hovered over her phone screen, the glow from the device casting a soft light across her face as she sat at the desk in her suite. The peacefulness of the room contrasted sharply with the quiet storm she could feel brewing just beneath the surface. Savannah's warm morning light streamed through the large bay window, but inside, Maggie was still turning the events of the past 24 hours over in her mind, each move she'd made settling into place like pieces of a carefully laid puzzle. The text from Allison last night still lingered in her thoughts. "You can't cancel the ghost tour. I've already booked it for us." It wasn't the message itself that bothered her. It was the presumption. The way Allison thought she could reclaim control of a weekend that Maggie had, without question, paid for and reserved as her own. Maggie had already drawn her boundaries, and they were firm. She stood up from the desk and walked to the plush armchair by the window, phone still in hand. Her reflection ghosted on the glass as she looked out at the street below. The cobblestone lanes were quiet this early in the morning, just the soft patter of footsteps from early risers. Maggie took a deep breath, then tapped the concierge app with the practiced precision of someone who had made decisions like this countless times before. She navigated to the settings with a single swipe, searching for the guest list. She'd already seen the booking for Allison and Ryan's room, the one that had been reassigned without so much as a second thought. The concierge's name appeared on the screen, followed by the room details. Without hesitation, Maggie composed a message and hit send. Please blacklist Allison Burke from using my name or personal details for any future reservations. Thank you. Her finger lingered over the screen for just a moment longer before the message was sent. It was simple, polite, but firm. She leaned back in the chair, her eyes catching the soft, dusty light that filtered in. The city, still so quiet and unmoving, was the perfect contrast to the internal satisfaction she felt. She was no longer just a passive participant. She was taking control in a way that Allison, for all her planning and control, could never have anticipated. Ryan's text arrived just as Maggie set the phone down on the desk. He had been quiet all morning, and she knew why. She could feel the pressure mounting on him, the weight of his role in all of this. "You're being extreme," the message read. Maggie didn't need to think long about how to respond. She knew the words that would close this conversation with finality, the ones that would leave no room for misinterpretation. "No, I'm being accurate." She sent it, the words more of a reminder to herself than a message to him. She was accurate in what she had done. She had set her boundaries. No one would cross them again. Not Allison. Not Ryan. No one. She placed the phone face down on the desk, her mind now at peace with her decisions. Maggie was done trying to explain herself, done justifying her actions. She had no need to. She had claimed her autonomy. It was hers, and no one would take it from her. The morning passed slowly, and Maggie enjoyed the quiet. She had made breakfast plans for herself and Sienna. Nothing extravagant, just a peaceful meal together. As she sipped her coffee, staring out the window, she heard a soft knock at the door. Maggie's heart skipped as the door cracked open. And there stood Sienna, her big brown eyes full of both mischief and concern. "Nana?" Sienna's voice was tentative, as if she were unsure whether she should even be here. "Come in, sweetheart," Maggie said, her voice soft. "You look like you're up early." Sienna hesitated, then crossed the threshold and sat down beside Maggie at the table. She looked at her for a long moment, her eyes searching, and then, almost in a whisper, she spoke. "I cried last night," she said, her voice barely audible. "Mom said I wasn't allowed to go on the ghost tour with you." Maggie's heart clenched at the words. She didn't need to ask more. She could see it in Sienna's eyes. The frustration, the confusion. She knew Sienna wanted to be with her, and Maggie could feel the ache of that desire. The little girl just wanted to share something special with her Nana. Maggie reached out and gently took Sienna's hand. "You don't have to worry about that," she said, her tone as steady as the calm she felt inside. "This weekend will still be good. For you and me. I promised you, didn't I? No one can take that from us." Sienna's face softened as she leaned into Maggie's side, the slight warmth of the girl's body against hers bringing her a momentary peace. For just a moment, Maggie allowed herself to feel the full weight of her decisions. She'd taken control, but in doing so, she had also ensured that her time with Sienna would be sacred, unblemished by the tension around them. Outside, the street remained still, the sounds of Savannah distant and muffled, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Maggie looked down at Sienna, her fingers brushing the girl's hair. "This weekend is ours," she whispered softly. "Just wait. The adventure we're about to have. It will be worth everything." As she spoke, a small, satisfied smile tugged at the corners of her lips. She had already made the choice, and it would be everything she needed. For once, no one else had a say in the matter. The afternoon slipped by quietly as Maggie sat in her suite, the sun casting a warm amber glow over the room. Sienna had just left for a quick trip with a local guide, excited to explore more of the city. Maggie let her go with a heart full of hope. There was something pure about the way Sienna saw the world, full of possibility, even in the face of conflict. Maggie reached for her phone, still resting on the desk where she'd left it earlier. Her gaze flickered to the social media app, still open from the photo she'd posted the night before. The picture was there, her glass of wine caught perfectly in the golden light, the river in the distance reflecting the last of the daylight. She had added the words, "Travel well, especially alone," and tagged it with "Hal, living on me terms." The reactions had flooded in. Likes, comments, people showing support. Some more surprised than others. But what caught her eye now wasn't the notification of likes or the comments. It was the post Allison had made shortly after, an innocuous vacation album. The photos were carefully curated, images of picturesque moments, smiles that hid the real tension, and not a single mention of Maggie. Maggie could almost hear the weight of Allison's pride in the way the post had been designed, a final push to rewrite the narrative, to erase her. But Maggie wasn't done. She took a screenshot of Allison's post, the words, "How to lose first-class support," already forming in her mind. Her fingers hovered for a moment before she tapped the forward button, sending the image to Lucille. A second later, Lucille's message pinged back. "Frame it. Title it, 'How to Lose First-Class Support.'" Maggie smiled softly, feeling a warmth in the moment. Lucille had always understood her better than most. She responded with a quick thumbs up and then set the phone down beside her. It was time to act. Maggie stood up, smoothing her dress, and walked to the desk. She pulled out a clean sheet of paper and a pen. The motion was simple but deliberate. She didn't need to think about what she was writing. This wasn't about a vacation or a family squabble. It was about respect. Maggie's voice had always been quiet, but when she spoke, it was heard. She carefully wrote a note in her neat, flowing handwriting. "This isn't about travel. This is about dignity." It was short, to the point. Maggie folded the note and placed it on the front desk, along with a small, polite instruction. She didn't need to explain further. The concierge would understand the gravity of what she was doing. As she left the note, the concierge caught her eye, a silent understanding passing between them. It didn't take much to read the air. They had seen her stand tall in the face of adversity all weekend. Now, they were prepared for the next step. "Add Allison Burke to the Do Not Disturb list, please," Maggie said in a quiet, measured tone. The concierge nodded, the shift in Maggie's demeanor clear. This wasn't just about an uncomfortable family trip anymore. This was about setting a boundary, and Maggie wasn't interested in revisiting it. The young woman behind the desk entered the request into the system without question, her fingers tapping the keys quickly, her expression neutral. But Maggie knew. She didn't need to see the action. She could feel it. The shift. The world bending just a little more in her direction. The evening settled in, the light outside dimming slowly as Maggie walked back into her suite, feeling the weight of the quiet in the air. She had made her moves. The battle was still unfolding, but it was hers to win. But then, there was a knock. Maggie's eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing the hesitation in the knock. It wasn't forceful, not like someone demanding entry. It was a quieter kind of knock, the kind that begged for permission to exist. She walked to the door, opened it without a word, and there stood Ryan. His eyes were tired, his shoulders slightly hunched as if the weight of the past few hours had finally caught up with him. "Mom, can we fix this?" His voice was softer than it had been all weekend, a mixture of frustration and pleading wrapped in one. He was caught between two worlds, trying to find a way out. Maggie stood there for a long moment, her gaze steady. She didn't move, didn't invite him in. She didn't need to. She was in control. "You've already made your choice, Ryan," Maggie said quietly, her voice calm but heavy with resolve. "This isn't something that needs fixing. You're either with me or you're not." He shifted uncomfortably, his hands in his pockets, looking like he didn't know how to respond. But Maggie didn't need him to say anything. The choices had already been made. Her quiet defiance had changed everything, and Ryan, just like Allison, would have to reckon with it in his own way. "Good night, Ryan," Maggie said, her voice firm but not unkind. Without another word, she closed the door, the finality of it hanging in the air. And as the lock clicked into place, Maggie turned toward the window, looking out over Savannah. The city shimmered with soft, golden light, peaceful and quiet, as though it, too, understood that sometimes, in order to move forward, one must first stand alone. For now, that was enough. The battle had only just begun, but Maggie was already winning. The morning light poured into Maggie's suite, bright and unrelenting, as if Savannah itself had decided to cast off any lingering shadows. She stood by the window looking out over the city, quiet now, still, with only the faintest hum of life below. For a brief moment she allowed herself to simply be. She'd done the hard work, set the boundaries, made the choices, and stood firm. But now it was time for the next steps. Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. It was a text from Lucille. Maggie smiled as she picked it up, already anticipating the tone. "So, are we ready for the next chapter?" Maggie's finger hovered over the screen for a moment before typing back a reply. "It's time." She set the phone down and reached for the desk, opening the drawer to pull out the papers that had been waiting for her attention. The financial advisor's number was already saved. She had been meaning to call, to make some adjustments to her will, but today, it felt different. It felt urgent. It was time to take the next step in protecting what she valued most. She pressed the number and listened to the ring, her fingers tapping lightly on the table. The phone picked up, and she wasted no time with pleasantries. "Hello, Charles. It's Maggie Burke. I'd like to make a few updates to my will." The voice on the other end was quick and professional. "Of course, Maggie. What would you like to adjust?" Maggie paused, her thoughts crystallizing as she spoke. "I'm making Sienna the sole beneficiary of my travel trust. I want to ensure that she's taken care of for our trips. No interference, no questions. She'll have annual trips paid in full, and her parents won't have a say in it." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, but Charles was quick to respond. "Understood. Is there anything else you'd like to include?" "Just one more thing," Maggie said. She could already hear the change in her own voice, a clarity, a certainty. "Update my emergency contact list. I'd like to replace Ryan with Lucille. She's more reliable." Charles didn't question it. He didn't need to. "Got it, Maggie. I'll send the updated documents your way." "Thanks, Charles. I'll sign as soon as they arrive." With that, Maggie ended the call, feeling a small wave of satisfaction settle over her. It wasn't just about money or arrangements. It was about taking ownership of her future, of ensuring that when she wasn't around, the people she trusted would have the control, not those who hadn't earned it. Later that afternoon, Maggie found herself seated at the same desk, her phone in hand again, but this time she was booking a flight. The soft tapping of her fingers on the keys was deliberate, rhythmic. She was making plans, real plans. Boston, her next destination. The fall foliage had always been something she'd wanted to see, and now there was nothing holding her back. No one to ask for permission, no one to tell her she couldn't. She typed in the dates, selecting the first-class option without hesitation, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The trip was booked before she had time to question it. Lucille's reply came just a few moments later. "Well, well, well. You just weaponized airline miles." Maggie smiled at the text, her fingers hovering over the keyboard for a second as she replied. "I weaponized being underestimated." The words were more than just a response. They were a statement. a declaration of the journey she was on, one that no one could interfere with, no matter how hard they tried. Maggie sat back in the chair, looking out at the street below, where people walked by, oblivious to the decisions being made in the quiet of her suite. She wasn't just taking control of her trips or her money, she was taking control of her narrative. And as she glanced at the calendar on the wall, her gaze steady and unblinking, Maggie knew this was only the beginning. She had set the stage, and now the world would watch her make her move. But this time, she wasn't playing by anyone else's rules. The door to her suite creaked open, and Maggie looked up, sensing a presence before she even saw it. But this time, it wasn't the knock she had expected. It was Sienna, standing in the doorway, eyes wide, face full of hope. "Nana?" the little girl said softly, stepping inside, her voice full of uncertainty. Maggie smiled. For once, she didn't need to say anything. The smile was enough to show Sienna that she was in safe hands. "This adventure is just beginning," Maggie whispered as Sienna came closer, ready for whatever came next. The morning air at the airport felt crisp and fresh, the kind of clarity that came with the first light of dawn. Maggie had arrived well before her scheduled departure time, as always. She liked the quiet, the stillness that came with being among the first to step into the terminal. It gave her time to think, to let her mind wander and settle into the rhythm of her next move. She glanced at the clock. It was still 2 hours before her flight, but she didn't mind. She had no rush. She was flying solo, and for the first time in a long while it felt like she was doing things exactly the way she wanted. Deshaun spotted her the moment she approached the desk. He gave her a small nod, and she smiled in return. She had learned long ago how to navigate airports with grace and confidence. And this was no different. The tension of the past few days had dissolved into a calm sense of inevitability. "Good to see you again, Ms. Burke," Deshaun said with a warm smile, his eyes flicking between Maggie and the screen in front of him. "I see you're on the flight back already." Maggie nodded. "It's been a good trip, but I think it's time to head home." She slid her boarding pass across the counter, and Deshaun looked it over with a quiet professionalism. His fingers moved over the keyboard with practiced ease as he processed her ticket. A sudden thought seemed to cross his mind. "Actually, there's an upgrade available. Would you like to take it?" he asked, his voice quieter now, as though the offer was meant just for her. Maggie didn't need to think twice. "Yes, please," she said, her smile lingering. The corner of Deshaun's mouth twitched upward, and he quickly made the changes. "Complimentary," he added, sliding the new boarding pass toward her. "Thank you," Maggie said, her fingers brushing over the pass. She could feel the weight of it, not just a ticket, but a symbol of everything she had done in the past few days. As she moved through security and toward the gate, her mind drifted back to the weekend, to the quiet triumphs she'd claimed along the way. She had given herself permission to be herself. Not the mother, not the grandmother, but just Maggie, on her own terms. The choices had been hers, and no one had taken that away. Not Allison, not Ryan, no one. But the echoes of her family's presence still lingered, like a faint shadow in the corners of her mind. She couldn't escape that. As she settled into her first-class seat, the soft leather welcoming her back into its embrace, she pulled out her phone to pass the time. Her fingers hovered over the screen when a new message popped up from Allison. "We missed our Uber. Can you wait for us?" The words were a strange mix of annoyance and desperation, the last vestiges of Allison's attempts to reclaim control. Maggie let out a quiet breath, the quiet strength of her resolve settling over her like a cloak. She typed her response quickly, not giving it a second thought. "No." The message was sent without hesitation. She didn't owe them anything. The boundaries had been set, and there was no reason to keep opening the door that had already been slammed shut. A moment later, the doors of the plane closed, and the engines began their low hum as they taxied down the runway. Maggie leaned back in her seat, her eyes drifting to the window, watching as the ground began to fall away beneath her. She could feel the rush of the takeoff, the power of the plane lifting her off the earth. She smiled to herself, her heart swelling with the freedom she had earned. She could feel the weight of the champagne flute in her hand, its bubbles rising, sparkling in the dim light of the cabin. It wasn't just a glass of champagne. It was a symbol of the victory she had claimed. No one had asked for permission. No one had gotten in her way. As the plane ascended higher, she let out a long, slow breath. She was free. Midway through the flight, her phone buzzed again, and Maggie reached for it, curious. She opened the message from Ryan. "I'm sorry. For everything. Can we talk when you get home?" Maggie stared at the message for a moment. She could almost hear his voice, a mixture of guilt and regret. The familiar ache of someone who knew they had let her down, but didn't know how to fix it. She didn't immediately respond. Instead, she stared out the window, the clouds passing by like slow-moving waves of white. The thought of Ryan's apology flickered through her mind, but it wasn't enough to move her. She didn't need his apology. What she needed, what she had already claimed, was peace. Maggie set the phone down, not replying. There was no need. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even disappointed. She had already moved on. The plane leveled out and she sank deeper into her seat, closing her eyes for a moment, letting the soft music and the hum of the engines wash over her. The world outside had become smaller, no longer a place where others dictated the terms of her life. For the first time in a long while, Maggie felt exactly where she belonged. And as the flight continued, she finally allowed herself to relax. The cab pulled up to the familiar front door of Maggie's condo, its warm, inviting exterior standing still against the chilled air of the evening. The world outside had shifted, but this place, this home, remained the same. She stepped out, feeling the slight weight of her suitcase in hand, but it was nothing compared to the weight she had carried just days before. There was a new lightness in her step, one that didn't come from travel or rest. It came from something deeper, from the sense of clarity and space she had carved for herself. The door clicked open, and a welcoming wave of warmth met her. Lucille, her ever-present and ever-faithful neighbor, had already been here. Maggie could tell by the soft, fragrant scent of freshly brewed coffee that filled the air, and there it was, the unmistakable sight of Lucille's perfect, careful touch. The fridge stocked with her favorite ingredients, the sheets on her bed turned down with a careful corner tuck, as if Lucille knew exactly how Maggie liked it after a long trip. Lucille was the type of person who understood the meaning of home. She knew that coming home wasn't about the objects or the space, but about the sense of safety and comfort one could feel. And Maggie had that, in abundance, thanks to Lucille's small but significant gestures. Maggie dropped her suitcase by the door and wandered into the kitchen. A glass of wine sat on the counter waiting for her, alongside a note that simply read, "You made it. Now rest, dear." She smiled softly, touched by Lucille's thoughtfulness. Maggie picked up the glass, swirled it in her hand, and took a slow sip. The taste was rich, familiar, and smooth, much like the feeling that settled over her now. This, after all, was hers. The peace, the quiet, the solitude she had sought. It was hers to keep. Maggie moved slowly through the living room, her gaze lingering over the quiet corners of her condo. She took her time, as if savoring the space she had made for herself. There was a comfort in the ordinary, the soft flicker of a lamp's light, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the smooth leather of her favorite armchair waiting for her to sink into it. It was the small things, the everyday details, that anchored her to this life, to her decisions. They were the things that reminded her that for once, she had done something for herself. She reached the hall, where her coat was draped over the chair by the door. There, hanging from the hook beside it, was her first-class lanyard. A simple symbol, now more meaningful than any material possession. It had been a ticket to her freedom, a reminder that, in the end, it was she who decided where her journey would take her. Without thinking, she hung it on the hook, its presence solidifying the space she had created. It was a small act, but it felt monumental. She was back. Not to the life she had left behind, but to a life she had chosen, on her own terms. Later that night, Maggie sat at her desk with the candle lit beside her. The soft amber light flickered across the room, casting long shadows on the walls. The silence of the evening surrounded her as she opened her journal, the pages already filled with her thoughts, her reflections. She picked up her pen and wrote, as she often did, to make sense of her journey. Exile is not the same as solitude. The words came to her easily, the truth of them settling into her chest. Exile was forced. Solitude, though, was a choice, and she had chosen it. She had taken control of her own narrative, stepping away from the expectations and limitations placed on her. She wasn't abandoned. She was simply free. The sound of a notification interrupted her thoughts, and Maggie's eyes flickered to the screen of her phone. Photos from the trip had arrived. She opened the album, scrolling through the familiar pictures, snapshots of the river, the old streets of Savannah, the quiet moments spent alone, savoring the beauty of the city. But there, at the end, was a photo of Sienna. The little girl, her eyes wide with wonder, smiling brightly on the ghost tour they had taken together. The only image Maggie felt was worth keeping. She saved the picture of Sienna, then deleted the rest. Not long after, Maggie's phone buzzed with a notification from social media. She opened it, expecting another post from Allison, but this one was different. It was Allison's vacation album, tagged and titled with carefully chosen captions, the perfect images of family moments, yet without a single mention of Maggie. Not a single acknowledgement of the woman who had paid for the trip, who had helped organize it. Maggie stared at the screen for a long moment, her fingers still on the phone, the weight of Allison's omission hanging in the air. She didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to be included in Allison's narrative. Maggie had already walked away from it, and the truth of that was clear now. The absence of her name was telling in its own way. A text from Lucille flashed on the screen. "Deleted you from the narrative, huh?" Maggie smiled, the weight of it all lifting from her shoulders. She typed back quickly. "Good, I was done speaking." And just like that, Maggie closed the app. The quiet satisfaction of her actions settled over her once more. She had taken control of her story. She had no more words to offer. The rest of it would unfold on its own. She was done explaining herself. Maggie sat at her desk, the polished invitation in front of her. The envelope was elegant, thick, the kind of paper that made a statement before you even read a word. The gold foil of the lettering caught the light, sending little sparks of brilliance around the room. The words, "You are cordially invited," were etched in flowing script, but Maggie felt none of the warmth usually conveyed by such a phrase. She turned the envelope over, her fingers briefly brushing the edges before slipping it open. Inside, the invitation gleamed, but beneath the shiny surface, she could already feel the emptiness of it. The words inside were formal, perfunctory, as though her presence was merely an afterthought, a box to be ticked on some grand checklist of family obligation. There was no warmth here, no genuine request for her company, just a cold, obligatory formality. Her fingers lingered over the embossed script, her mind running through the memories of the last few days. The distance between her and them had only grown, the walls she had built, the spaces she had carved out, were so much more than a physical distance. They were emotional too, and no invitation, however beautifully crafted, could change that. She sat back, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the page again. "We hope you can join us for a family gathering, a celebration of sorts. Your presence would mean a great deal to us." The rest was a blur. The words were empty, meaningless. A small smile tugged at the corners of Maggie's lips. The invitation, with all its grandeur, was nothing more than a tool for Allison to hold power over her again, to try to draw her back into the fold, to continue where they had left off, where Allison had treated her like a shadow. No. Maggie reached for her pen, her movements deliberate. She didn't need to think about it. She had already made her decision. Her handwriting was smooth, flowing, with a controlled elegance that matched the tone she intended. "If I am invited, I require a seat, a voice, and dignity. If those aren't available, neither am I." She stopped for a moment, allowing the words to settle, to weigh their significance. It wasn't just a letter, it was a boundary. A clear, unambiguous declaration of who she was now. No more apologies, no more pretending. She folded the letter carefully and slid it into the envelope. Maggie felt a strange satisfaction in the small act. The decision to stand firm, even in the face of their attempts to pull her back into a place she had left behind. The door had closed for a reason, and no one was going to open it again without her permission. Next, Maggie turned to the other piece of paper beside her, the one she had written just a moment ago. It was a note for Sienna. A reminder of what this trip had meant, and a promise for what was to come. "Keep your bag packed, sweetheart. Adventure is never far." Maggie folded the note gently and placed it next to the letter she'd just written. A quiet part of her knew that Sienna was the one who would understand her most. The child who had seen her not as an inconvenience or a source of frustration, but as someone worthy of love, of connection. Maggie tucked both pieces into the envelope, sealing it with a quiet finality. This was her response. It would be the last they heard from her, at least for now. Her phone buzzed on the desk, breaking the stillness. Maggie glanced at the screen. Ryan's name appeared. Maggie had known this message would come. She had expected it. She hadn't been sure when, but the moment had arrived. His apology. A long overdue attempt to repair something broken between them. She took a deep breath before opening it. "I understand. I'm sorry for everything. I hope you can forgive me one day." It wasn't an easy message to read, but it wasn't the message she had been waiting for. It was the message he thought he needed to send, but Maggie wasn't looking for apologies anymore. She had already made her peace. She didn't reply immediately. She let the words settle. Let them sit with her for a moment. Then, after a long pause, she typed one simple line. "Understood." The reply was short, but it carried the weight of everything that had been said, and everything that had been left unsaid. Maggie didn't need to explain herself. Not to Ryan. Not to anyone. She hit send, then set her phone down, feeling a small sense of release, of closure. As the evening crept forward, Maggie allowed herself a small, contented sigh. She leaned back in her chair, watching the soft flicker of the candlelight dance in the corner of the room. The stillness of the condo enveloped her, the peace she had carved out for herself now feeling more real than ever. Lucille's voice floated into her mind, the playful teasing from their earlier exchanges. "You should start a blog. Petty in Paris." Maggie chuckled softly to herself, shaking her head. She could imagine it now. A blog with all the sharp edges of truth wrapped in humor, an unapologetic exploration of the art of living life on one's own terms. But she wasn't petty. No, she was something far more valuable. "I'm not petty. I'm premium," Maggie whispered to herself, the words a small mantra, a reminder that she had earned this, her peace, her space, her life. And as the night drew on, Maggie let herself relax, her thoughts already on the next adventure. After all, life was full of possibilities when you stopped waiting for permission. Maggie sat at the desk, the soft hum of the city outside her window the only sound breaking the silence of her condo. The room was quiet, her space completely her own. She was in no rush. The world had slowed down to match the rhythm of her life. After everything that had unfolded, Maggie had decided that she needed something special. Something for herself, and for Sienna. Spring break was just around the corner, and Maggie knew exactly what she wanted. A getaway. But this time, it wouldn't be for the family. It would be just for her and Sienna. No parents allowed. This was going to be their adventure. A time to bond without the usual distractions, without the weight of familial expectations. She pulled up the website for Charleston garden tours, her fingers gliding over the keys. The beautiful gardens, the historic streets, the charm of the South. It was the perfect destination for a spring break getaway, and it would be just the two of them. As she clicked through the booking options, Maggie's mind was already racing. She could see it. The two of them, exploring the lush gardens, taking slow walks through the streets lined with ancient oak trees, and simply enjoying each other's company. She clicked on the package for two. First-class flights, a suite, a week-long adventure. No distractions, no arguments, just peace. She selected the upgrade to a suite, a luxurious room overlooking the gardens. The words "confirmed" appeared on the screen, and a wave of satisfaction washed over Maggie. The trip was booked. It was done. The next morning, Maggie stood in the local department store, scanning the racks for the perfect luggage. She wanted something special for Sienna, a set that would feel just as important as the trip they were about to take. Her fingers brushed over the fabric of a deep navy suitcase set, its clean lines and durable zippers perfect for their travels. She picked up the set and smiled to herself. "For travelers only," she whispered, knowing that the words would mean something to Sienna. Something deeper than just a set of suitcases. It was a gift for her granddaughter, a way to show her that this trip was just the beginning of many adventures to come. As she walked through the store, her mind drifted to Ryan. She could already hear his voice in her head. "Can I join?" She imagined him trying to force his way into this trip as he always did, making it about him, about their fractured relationship. But Maggie wasn't interested in bringing him along. This trip wasn't for him. It was for Sienna. She had already made her decision, and she was sticking with it. Back at the condo, Maggie placed the suitcase set on the bed, her fingers brushing the tags as she thought about the upcoming trip. The anticipation made her smile, but there was something else too. A sense of pride. She had planned this on her own. She had taken control. It was her choice, and no one else's. Ryan had already texted her about the trip. He asked to join, but Maggie's response had been simple, to the point. "This trip is for Sienna and me. It's something we need." "I'm sorry." She had hit send without a second thought, her mind already focused on what lay ahead. Later that afternoon, Lucille called. Maggie picked up the phone, her voice light but strong. "So, you're really going through with it, huh?" Lucille asked, a knowing smile evident in her tone. Maggie chuckled softly. "You bet I am. It's time for some real fun." Lucille's laugh rang out over the line. "Well, let's get you ready then. We need to make sure you both have the perfect outfits for Charleston. I'm thinking matching sun hats." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "Matching sun hats?" "Absolutely. It's the perfect statement. You and Sienna will look fabulous, and you'll make everyone jealous at the gardens." Maggie smiled, amused. "All right, Lucille, you're on." The following week, the two of them went out to shop for sun hats. Lucille was in her element, picking out bright straw hats adorned with ribbons, floral patterns, and the occasional feather. Maggie and Sienna modeled a few different ones before settling on the perfect pair. Sienna's eyes lit up when she tried hers on, twirling around in the mirror. "I love it, Nana," she exclaimed, her face beaming with joy. Maggie watched her granddaughter, heart swelling with affection. She felt a deep sense of contentment in that moment. This was it. This was the kind of trip they needed. Just the two of them, creating memories that would last a lifetime. That evening, Maggie sat down at her desk again, a soft sigh escaping her lips. She opened the safe in her closet and pulled out a folder, placing the trip itinerary inside. She had made a backup, just in case. A quiet reminder that no one else had a say in this trip. Not Ryan, not Allison. It was for her and Sienna, and no one could take that away. The world outside had already grown dark, the city lights casting long shadows through the window. Maggie leaned back in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. It was done. The trip was booked. The bags were packed. There was no turning back. She looked at the photo of Sienna on her desk, the one from their ghost tour. The smile on the little girl's face was all Maggie needed to see. She had made the right choice. And as the night grew quiet, Maggie allowed herself the simple pleasure of knowing that the next chapter of her life had already begun. Maggie sat at her desk, the dim glow of her desk lamp casting a steady light over the documents before her. She'd never felt more certain about her decisions than she did now. The weight of the past few months, the years of feeling dismissed, of being the afterthought, had finally reached its breaking point. This was no longer just about a trip or a family squabble. This was about reclaiming her life and her dignity. The first step in her plan had already been executed. She had booked the trip with Sienna. The next step, the harder one, would involve ensuring that no one could undo the boundaries she had set. She was tired of being the person they could push aside, the person they assumed they could control. Her phone buzzed. An incoming message from Lucille. "You ready to make them feel it?" Maggie smiled to herself, her fingers already moving toward her laptop. She wasn't just going to make them feel it. She was going to make sure they understood that things had changed, that she had changed. Allison's name had been a constant in Maggie's life, but not in a way that had ever been comforting or empowering. In the quiet of her condo, Maggie decided it was time to change that. With a few swift movements, she logged into her airline account, her fingers dancing across the keyboard with practiced precision. She started with Allison's name, removing it from all shared accounts, eliminating any access she had to their family travel rewards. It felt oddly satisfying, the finality of it, the realization that no one would be able to get in her way anymore. Next, Maggie moved her frequent flyer points into a trust, one that was locked in Sienna's name. The trust would ensure that Sienna would have access to those miles for her own adventures. Maggie had worked hard for every point, every reward, and now they would go to someone who truly appreciated them. Not someone who thought she was a convenience. The trust document had already been prepared, and Lucille had been more than willing to notarize it. Lucille had always been there for Maggie, in ways that her own family never could. Maggie's heart swelled at the thought of her friend's unwavering loyalty. After finishing the trust paperwork, Maggie sat back in her chair feeling a strange sense of calm. But there was still one more thing to do. She reached for her will. It had been years since she'd updated it. Years since she'd felt the need to reconsider the division of her estate. She scanned the document, her gaze landing on Ryan's name, the beneficiary of a large portion of her assets. Not anymore. She was done giving him the benefit of the doubt, done letting him off the hook for years of avoidance and neglect. It was time for him to understand that there were consequences to treating people like an afterthought. Maggie carefully rewrote her will, freezing Ryan's share of her estate unless an apology was made, one that was formal, one that acknowledged the hurt he had caused. Maggie was done being the person they could take for granted. The terms were clear now. If he wanted access to his inheritance, he would have to do the work, just like everyone else. She sat back, her fingers hovering over the last document, the final piece of her plan. A message to Allison. It wasn't long, but it was enough. She wasn't going to let Allison twist the narrative anymore. This is not manipulation, these are my terms. I am not a suitcase you can check in and forget. Maggie's finger hovered over the send button, but she didn't hesitate. She hit send, feeling the weight of her actions lifting from her shoulders. There was no second-guessing anymore. She wasn't just defending herself. She was defining who she was. The silence in the room was a stark contrast to the tumult of thoughts that had swirled in her mind over the last few weeks. Maggie leaned back in her chair, the coolness of the evening air creeping in through the window. It was a quiet kind of power that she had cultivated, and in that moment, she finally understood something that had eluded her for so long, the power of simply walking away from what no longer served her. Her phone buzzed again, this time a message from Ryan. "Mom, I'm sorry for how things have been. Can we talk when you get home?" Maggie stared at the screen for a moment. She could almost hear the tone in his voice, the regret laced with a subtle plea, but she wasn't ready to soften just yet. The terms had been set, and until Ryan understood that, there would be no more chances, no more excuses. She wasn't angry. She was just clear. Understood. She hit send, then set the phone down without another glance. The quiet settled back around Maggie like a comfortable blanket. She wasn't waiting for anyone to catch up with her anymore. She wasn't waiting for apologies or acknowledgement. She had already moved on. As the night wore on, the weight of her decisions settled into place, and Maggie allowed herself a moment of peace. The journey ahead was hers to define, and the first step was already done. She had locked them out, and in doing so, had finally unlocked the life she had always deserved. And with that, she could sleep. Maggie stood in the doorway of her home office, her eyes scanning the room with a quiet satisfaction. This space, once filled with piles of work and scattered papers, had become a sanctuary of sorts. A place that now held only what mattered, the remnants of her past and the promise of her future. Today, it would become something else entirely. She had always been meticulous. It was in her nature. She liked order, structure, and knowing exactly where everything was. But something had shifted in her since the last few months. Now, as she stood in the center of the room, she realized it was time to create a space that was not just functional, but meaningful. A space that reflected the woman she had become. The first step was the walls. She grabbed a few rolled-up maps she'd kept over the years, their creases folding like old memories, their colors muted by time. These weren't just decorative, they were reminders of the places she'd seen and the places she planned to go. She started tacking them up, a map of the world, another of the Alaskan coastline, destinations she had dreamed of, places she could finally visit on her own terms. As she worked, her mind drifted. The memories weren't painful anymore. They were just pieces of the puzzle. She'd lived for so long in the margins of others' lives, but now she had claimed the center. Every pin she placed on the map was a mark of her own journey, a step away from the past and toward something that was entirely hers. When the maps were hung, Maggie turned to her bookshelf, where old journals sat with their leather covers worn from years of use. She pulled them down, flipping through the pages filled with travel notes, thoughts, ideas, all the places she had yet to go, all the things she still wanted to experience. She placed them in a new place of honor on the shelf, where they could be easily reached, like open doors to new adventures. She moved to the window and stared out at the city, the same city she had spent so many years in, but this time, it felt different. She wasn't just living in it. She was ready to leave it behind, to explore beyond the horizon. Later, when the room was finally taking shape, Maggie stepped back and surveyed her work. The maps were tacked, the journals arranged, and there, framed on the wall, was a photo she had taken on her last flight. Her first time in first class. In the photo, she was smiling, her glass raised in a quiet celebration. She looked relaxed, serene, free. She placed the photo carefully in a frame, pausing for a moment before deciding what to write on it. The words came easily. Section 2A. Where silence flies first. It was simple, but it encapsulated everything she felt. This wasn't just about the luxury of first class. It was about the peace she'd found in silence, in solitude, in reclaiming herself. Lucille stopped by that afternoon, a bag of new trinkets in her arms, her grin wide as she stepped into the office. "I think this room needs something, don't you?" Maggie raised an eyebrow, amused. "Oh, I'm sure you have something in mind." Lucille placed a small sign on the desk. It was simple but bold, with bright letters that read, "Priority, Respect." Maggie laughed, her heart warmed by Lucille's thoughtfulness. "It's perfect," she said, her voice steady. The sign wasn't just a decoration, it was a declaration. Respect. That's what Maggie had earned, and that's what she intended to demand moving forward. Lucille, ever the practical friend, didn't wait for Maggie to ask. "I also brought over a few things for your emergency file," she said, pulling out a neat stack of papers. "Just in case. You've been through enough of this family drama, Maggie. It's time to have everything in order." Maggie smiled, already knowing what Lucille had prepared. "You know me too well," she said, taking the papers from her. Lucille had included every possible scenario in the emergency file, from medical details to property instructions, with the understanding that no one else had a claim over her future. In the event of anything, Maggie would be in control. She added the file to the safe with a calm sense of relief. The evening settled over the condo like a soft blanket. The office was complete. It was her space, her sanctuary. A room that symbolized everything she had fought for: freedom, respect, and peace. Maggie sank into her chair, looking around at the walls she had transformed. This wasn't just a room. This was a reflection of her new life. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from her travel advisor, confirming her upcoming bookings. Maggie had been thinking about the future again, about new places to explore, new experiences to live. Alaska was on her mind now, and the promise of an Alaskan cruise was becoming more than just a dream. She had made all the necessary arrangements, already looking ahead to the next adventure. She opened her phone to do a little research, typing Alaska Cruise Lines into the search bar. The world seemed so wide, so full of promise, and she had only just begun to see it. There was still so much more to discover. Her finger hovered over the screen as she scrolled through options. This wasn't just about the places she could go. It was about who she had become. A woman who no longer waited for permission, no longer settled for scraps. Maggie was ready to set sail on a new journey, and this time, it was entirely her own. And as the screen loaded, Maggie smiled, the quiet excitement building in her chest. There was no turning back now. She had claimed the room, and now, she was about to claim the world. Maggie stepped into her kitchen, the soft hum of the city outside her window blending with the quiet morning stillness inside. The day stretched ahead of her like an unwritten page, waiting to be filled. She filled the kettle with water, the rhythmic sound of it sloshing gently filling the air. As it began to heat, she moved to her desk, still feeling the warm, steady satisfaction of the space she had carved out for herself. The office was exactly as she wanted it, a sanctuary of memories and intentions. The maps on the walls, the journals stacked neatly, and the simple sign that read, "Priority, respect." It was a room that radiated strength, that held the essence of who she had become and who she was still becoming. The kettle clicked off, the water ready, and Maggie poured it over the tea leaves in her favorite mug. She watched the steam rise, filling the space with the rich, calming scent. She sat down at her desk, cradling the mug in her hands as she opened her laptop. Her finger hovered over the keys for a moment before she began to type. It was something she had been thinking about for a while now, a plan she had crafted. Another adventure, another solo journey to remind herself that she was still capable of moving forward on her own terms. She didn't need anyone's approval. She didn't need anyone at all. With a few swift keystrokes, she opened the travel website and began searching for her next destination. There was still so much left to see, and she intended to see it all, just as she had done before. She typed "first class" in the search bar, as naturally as she breathed. The luxury of it no longer a novelty, but a symbol of the life she had claimed. A few clicks later, the itinerary was set. First class. A solo journey to the Pacific Northwest. The dates were perfect. The destination just right. It was a trip meant for her. No one else. Not Ryan. Not Allison. No one who didn't understand her worth. She clicked book, and the confirmation screen lit up. The satisfaction that followed wasn't just from the trip itself, but from knowing she had made this decision on her own. No hesitation. No compromise. Just Maggie. With a smile on her face, she reached over and wrote in her journal, the ink flowing easily as she reflected on the weight of the decision. They tried to send me back. I sent myself forward. Her pen hovered for a moment longer, the weight of those words settling into her chest like a quiet affirmation. She had faced the attempts to control her, to force her back into a box she'd outgrown, and she had refused. It was time to move forward, no looking back. She had already claimed the space in her life that was meant for her, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her again. Later, as the afternoon light softened, Maggie walked past her luggage, the leather handle of her suitcase catching the light as it sat neatly by the door. It was a reminder, not just of the upcoming trip, but of the journey she had already taken to get here. The smooth surface of the bag felt comforting, like a partner in the adventure that awaited. Lucille's voice echoed in her mind, the teasing tone still fresh. "You ever going to let them back in?" Maggie chuckled softly to herself, her fingers brushing over the leather as if to reaffirm her decision. The question had been asked so many times, in different forms over the years, but the answer was clear now. "No," Maggie whispered to the empty room, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't repeat legs of a journey that taught me too much." Her phone buzzed again, and she picked it up, glancing at the screen. It was a text from Lucille. "Well, I suppose it's just you, the open road, and first class, huh?" Maggie smiled, knowing Lucille understood better than anyone. It wasn't just the luxury of the seat that mattered. It was the space she had carved out for herself. The room she had claimed, and the boundaries she had set. A few hours later, as Maggie walked toward the airport terminal, the familiar feeling of calm washed over her again. She stood in line, the crowd around her moving in a blur, their hurried steps and anxious expressions foreign to her now. She was no longer waiting for permission to move. She was already moving, forward, toward what was next. At the gate, as the boarding process began, she was ushered through first class with a nod of recognition from the staff. She didn't need to look back to know that Allison and Ryan were somewhere farther back in the crowd, still fighting for their place, still trying to manipulate the narrative. But it didn't matter. Maggie walked with purpose, the feeling of the soft leather seat beneath her as she sank into the chair a small victory. A glass of champagne appeared in front of her, and she took it without a second thought, raising it to herself. The plane began its taxi to the runway, the engines purring with anticipation, and Maggie's heart surged with the same energy. She was untethered, free. Her phone buzzed once more, but this time she didn't need to check it. She already knew. She had made her choices. And nothing, no apology, no offer of reconciliation, would change the path she had set. The plane took off, lifting into the sky, and as Maggie looked out the window, she could almost feel the weight of the past falling away beneath her. At the airport, her daughter-in-law had snatched her ticket and told her to stay home, so Maggie had flown first class, alone. And for the first time in years, she was exactly where she was meant to be.